And I believe that humans are ecosystem engineers. That concept we know from elephants, are really important for shaping an ecosystem, or beavers who change an entire landscape by changing the water table. Humans are nature's most powerful ecosystem engineers. So we can use that power for good, and we can actually shape ecosystems and create diversity and abundance by working with nature.
I want to welcome everyone back to the Green Hour. We are sitting here live at Climate Week New York City with Tim Christophersen, VP of Climate Action for Salesforce. Tim, it's a really good day. We're going to be talking about your new book that's coming out October 14th, Generation Restoration, How to Fix Our Relationship Crisis with Mother Nature. So yeah, just thank you so much for joining us. I will say you're one of the only two-time guests on the Green Hour podcast.
It's great to see you again, Preston.
Yeah,
thank you.
It really is. It really is. So the first thing I'll ask is, what led you to write this book? And I think this book right now is coming at the right time.
I've worked on this interface between nature and humanity's supply chain, if you will, and climate change for 25 years. So I was starting to ask myself bigger and bigger questions because I didn't see a lot of progress happening. Biodiversity is still in free fall. Climate change is still accelerating. We're seeing progress on both fronts, but it's not fast enough. So I try to go a level deeper and ask myself, what are the root causes for this crisis that we're in, and how can we turn that into an opportunity for all of humanity? So that's what the book is about.
Talked in the beginning, we were talking about how ecosystems kind of being degraded, right, by different things, human action. And I think a book like this is, like I said, it's in perfect timing because now we're able to see how can humanity and nature come back together and have that relationship. In the world that I work in with circularity, we always talk about how can we eliminate waste, right, and restore nature while we're doing that. So I think something like this is, again, perfect timing, and it's something that needs to be read, I would say, for future generations.
And there's so much we can learn from nature. You mentioned circularity. There's no such thing as waste in nature. Everything is just part of a cycle of life. And somehow we've almost stepped out of that cycle that nature has been helping us with and running for humanity for all of our history. And we now see ourselves as apart from nature. And the book is very much about recognizing that we are and always have been part of nature. Nature is our home, is our family. It's more than a line on the balance sheet. So I think it's great that we are seeing more and more companies recognize their dependency on nature. Governments are starting to account for what is called natural capital. So I think that's a good start. But I want to try to see if we can go beyond that transactional relationship with nature to a reciprocal relationship with nature, where we give back to nature because nature has always nurtured us. And as Jane Goodall says in her foreword, nature has always taken care of humanity, and now she needs our help. So it's time to give back to nature.
Yeah.
Of course, I go into these concepts of natural capital and why investing in nature makes financial sense. And there's a lot of science in the book, and it's about 20 pages of scientific footnotes.
Yeah.
But I think the personal note in the book is what is most important to me, bringing it home to what this means for our relationship with nature for each and every one of us, because nature is waiting for us to make the step and to come home, in a sense.
Yeah. I do want to look back at your life for a second and just understand, what brought you here today, to writing this book, working in the field that you work in. The note that I have down is, your early experiences with your grandfather in the forest really helped shape your ecological literacy. Could you talk about that relationship and then growing up and how that kind of led you into what you're doing today?
I grew up in a very rural setting in a small village. There wasn't really that much to do other than be in nature and go fishing and camping, and went on long walks with my grandfather, who was a forest ranger. And that shaped my sense of the world and sense of reality. But like most children, when they grow up, they assume that's just the same for everybody else. So this is, it took me a long time to realize that deep connection with nature is not something we can take for granted. Even though we are hardwired to have affinity to nature, that's the so-called biophilia concept by E.O. Wilson, because we have evolved in close relationship with nature. So I've yet to meet somebody who says, well, nature really is terrible. I don't want to have anything to do with nature, or I don't like trees. So I think there's this biophilia in all of us, but rediscovering that can turn into a deep, meaningful relationship with a sense of place, with a sense of home, with a sense of landscape. That is, I think, something we can rediscover. And there's so much to gain. There are only upsides. There are only wins from doing this, engaging in the restoration of ecosystems at planetary scale, starting where we all live.
Yeah.
Because it makes the world safer, healthier, cleaner, greener. There's more nutritious food. There are more green jobs. So, what's not to like about restoring nature and rebuilding that relationship with nature?
I mean, when I think about sustainability, and I'll talk to people across the board, right, from all different walks of life and all different fields, and it's like, at the end of the day, sustainability is everyone wants clean water, clean air, a clean place to live, right? And how do we get there? And I think having a relationship and building that relationship back with nature is a big thing. And you mentioned biophilia. So I work in a big company in the built environment, and I present with architects and designers a lot. And biophilic design in like flooring and in the interior is a huge concept right now. And there's studies, I think there's studies out there, psychological studies that say when you incorporate biophilic design into an office space, it actually raises productivity. So I think us as humans want to be with nature. And even when we're in spaces, when we're working in offices, it's like we're designing them to kind of emulate nature.
One of the first studies I read about nature when I started my career was on urban forestry, and it was about hospital patients, that they are released earlier on average if they look out onto a green space than if they look out onto a brick wall or a building. So I think the relationship with nature also always gives back to us. It gives back in terms of health, and as you mentioned, clean air, clean water. So it's also, in a sense, something that I think transcends political positions, because everybody wants a cleaner future and a healthy environment, healthy nature for themselves and for the next generation. So it is, I hope, something that can also unite us in this time of a lot of debate about what the right course forward is on things like climate change, but nature-based solutions to the problems that we're facing, whether it's a warming climate, or it is depletion of freshwater resources, or it's the plummeting of wildlife populations. All of that benefits from investing more in nature.
So I think looking back at your life for one more second, and then we'll get back into the book a little bit more, but what I found is you actually have a regenerative farm where you live. So can you talk about that farm, how that came to be, and then again, how that kind of shaped your perspective on all these things?
Yeah, I sometimes get asked, how can you be a VP in a big tech company and write a book and run a farm? So first of all, I have to say, I don't run the farm. My wife is the planner and manager, and she sort of runs I get to help out once in a while when I have time. So just want to make that clear. But our farm, the concept we have is one of permaculture and working with nature instead of against nature. And even though we only bought it 5 years ago, it used to be a dairy farm, and we're now shifting it to agroforestry, so trees on fields and then rotating sheep grazing underneath the trees. And even though it's relatively small and we only started recently, nature is bouncing back amazingly fast. So we already there's about 15 species of bats in Denmark where our farm is, and 8 of them are already back over a small lake that we dug out. Within 2 years, we planted 30,000 trees, forested a whole field that is now full of wildlife and insects and butterflies and birds. And before that, it was an industrially managed monoculture crop field without much diversity. So that speed of nature coming back is really giving me a lot of hope, because imagine we could do that on one farm, what we could do for the whole planet if we worked with nature. And I think industrial farming, agriculture is to nature basically what energy is to climate change. It's the most important sector for becoming from at the moment being a bit of a problem for farmers who are struggling to make ends meet, but also for nature, to becoming part of the solution. That is the biggest change that we can make. And I think farmers are ready to make that change if they get support, and get, in some cases, also financial support for that transition. So for us, it's really a big adventure, and I have a lot of respect for everybody who's a farmer. This is so hard work, and it's so complicated, and you have to know so much. So my respect to everybody who grows our food. They're really underappreciated, I think.
I think people say that the first environmental activists, advocates were farmers, and they were really the people that, blazed the trail. And after that, everyone's trying to, join in.
Yeah.
So
I think that's right. And I think this connection with the land is also still, of course, there when you actually work with the land and work with nature. So a lot of the farmers in our community, they're really interested in working in regenerative agriculture, but there's a lot of hurdles, and the current system is sort of set against that kind of transition. But it's starting to change. In the European Union, for example, there's now, for the first time, you can get government subsidies for things like agroforestry and shifting to regenerative agriculture. That didn't exist a few years ago, and that's really promising.
Yeah. So this concept of regenerative agriculture, could you talk through that a little bit too? Because I think some of our listeners, we've had episodes on the past with that topic, but they might not have a great grasp of it. So could you describe what that is and how that would work in practice? Maybe there's some examples from the book too on regenerative agriculture.
There are examples in the book. So I would bring it down to two simple concepts. How much life is in your soil? Because there's a lot of life not only above the soil, but there's, in a teaspoon of healthy soil, there's about as many microorganisms as there are people on Earth, right? So, but if that disappears, your soil can produce less nutritious food, and you have to replace those functions with expensive fertilizers and other inputs. The other concept is carbon, that we talk a lot about in climate change, but carbon is also the most important ingredient in soils that makes soils productive. Soil organic carbon is what allows plants to grow, absorbs water and stores it. It's basically the part of the soil that is alive. So the more life in the soil, the more carbon is drawn into the soil, which, by the way, solves climate change very beautifully, and the more productive the land becomes. So you regenerate that system, and that can all be done working with nature. You don't need any expensive products. This can all be done with ingredients that are usually locally found. You need livestock, though. So it's one of those things where there's a debate right now between vegans and vegetarians and people who don't want to eat meat, which is, everybody's, of course, free to choose what they want to do. But for our family, we are choosing to eat meat that is coming from these sustainably managed lands, because livestock, and in particular cows, have an important role in activating that system and making sure that cycle of life, the circularity, if you will, of the soil and of the nutrients in the soil is running. So livestock is an important part of regenerative farming.
Yeah, and circularity, we like to say that waste doesn't exist in nature.
Yes.
Humans invented waste, and now we have to figure out what to do with it.
Absolutely.
But I do want to get back to the book for a second. And one note that I have down is, you warn about shifting baseline symptoms. How do we counter this amnesia of abundance?
I talk about a story. I tell a story in the book of a fishing trip that started in 1957 off the Florida Keys. There was 3 tourists who chartered a fishing boat called the Gulf Stream for a day. And we know this because the same fishing company ran fishing tours off the Key West for 50 years, and they always took a photo when they came home with their catch. So you take a photo from 1957, and there are 2-meter-long sharks, giant groupers. It's a harvest of abundance. You take the same photo in 2007, the catch size has been reduced by 90% on average. There are far fewer species. There are almost no sharks left. But when you look at the faces of the people in the photos, they look equally happy. They don't know. This is shifting baseline syndrome. Basically, every generation takes the degraded state of nature and environment for granted as the new normal. So we have to remember how rich we once were in terms of our natural heritage, where that's all gone, and how we can get it back. And of course, this is where AI comes in, right? It can help us to paint that picture of what we once had, of the current state, and of the future abundance that we can get back to.
I think we were talking before this about the software platform I'd worked with, and it basically grades the ecosystem, let's say of an office space, a manufacturing facility, pre-development, current development, and then you figure out how can you implement nature-based solutions to improve the ecosystem score. So it's a really cool, I would say, platform that we worked with, but it's kind of getting back to this, and it's like, how can we, in that space, in buildings and manufacturing and development, how can we get back to the state where the land was before development and get the ecosystem back? And nature-based solutions, I think, are the key to that.
I would even go one step further. There's a lot of talk in corporate circles these days about this concept of nature positive. So how can you not only do no harm, but how can you work with nature to improve the state of an ecosystem? And I believe that humans are ecosystem engineers. That concept we know from elephants are really important for shaping an ecosystem, or beavers who change an entire landscape by changing the water table. Humans are nature's most powerful ecosystem engineers. So we can use that power for good, and we can actually shape ecosystems and create diversity and abundance by working with nature. So if you take these metrics and you go to a site and see what did it look like before the construction began, what can it look like afterwards, what are all these ecosystem services like clean water that nature provides, how can we restore them to a level that they support all of our human development. And there's a lot of progress that's been made in the metrics around that, how to measure that. Everything from eDNA, where you just take a swab of a little soil sample or a drop of water from a water body, and you can see all the species that have been in contact with that water.
Yeah.
So these are all technologies that are new. We have soil acoustic monitoring. So there are now microphones you can put in the soil. You can hear how much microdiversity there is in the soil. And these are all new technologies that you can use to see how nature is doing and if it's improving or degrading. Because restoration is not an end goal, it's a process. Something either gets better or gets worse. And there are many ways to measure that. And I think humans have the ability, even in cities and in densely populated areas, to improve on nature and make sure we make an ecosystem better by being there instead of worse. That is what restoration means.
Yeah. So I think in today's world, technology is king, right? How can we leverage AI to, look at these things that you're mentioning? But I do think looking at the traditional knowledge of local people is also important. I think you definitely talk about that in the book. We're doing a series with the Nature Conservancy right now in Latin America, and we're talking a lot about how indigenous people are kind of the key to saving the Amazon rainforest. And there's some really cool stats out there, but I did want to ask you, how can modern societies learn from indigenous people around restoration and ecosystems and, having that connection and relationship with nature?
In the book, I talk about one of my favorite projects in the world, which is called Acción Andina. So it's also in Latin America. If you have a chance to talk to them, you should. It's an indigenous-led movement that is restoring all the high Andes watersheds. So you go 12, 13,000 feet and above. There used to be dense forests, cloud forests that would capture the moisture from the clouds, store it in wetlands, and then sort of trickle it down to the whole continent for rivers and drinking fresh water. There's only about 10% of those forests left, and that's a huge problem because also the glaciers are melting. So the South America, or large parts of it, are running out of water. So restoring those forests is very important. But here's the interesting part. The indigenous communities, and there's now about 30,000 volunteers in Acción Andina, 400 sites, planted 10 million trees. They don't plant for, carbon credits or timber. They plant because it's a system of reciprocity with the mountain ecosystem. You give to the mountain gives to you. And you give to your community, the community takes care of you. That reciprocity, I think we have lost in much of Western society. But interestingly, when you look closer at a local traditional ecological knowledge, which exists still in many places, even in rural farming communities in the US or Japan or Europe, you find that local traditional knowledge of when to harvest, what to take, how to invest back in nature, how to work with nature. So I think a lot of it is rediscovering that knowledge, and above all, listening to nature and listening to the ecosystems, understanding how we can work with nature, because we will all be better off if we do that.
So I think in the beginning we talked about, how we're seeing biodiversity loss. A book like this is very important to kind of figure out how can we connect nature and society back? How can we fix that relationship between the two? But there is a lot of, I would say, doom and gloom out there, about our current ecosystem, how we're trending towards things like the Paris Agreement, global temperature rise. How do we find hope in the midst, I would say, of what we see as despair?
Yeah. It's something that I've thought a lot about, and what I find fascinating is that when we talk about issues like climate change, which are complex and daunting, there seems to have been a development straight from denying that there was a problem to saying, oh, it's too late to do anything about it, skipping over all the solutions that exist in between. And that's where we need to focus, because so much is happening. There's so many positive developments all across the world, both in terms of energy transition, nature investments. So the first thing to do is to focus on the positive, because where you focus your energy, that is where you can create reality. We have the ability with our thoughts and actions to make things happen. Everything that you look around you has once been a thought in somebody's head. So what we focus our attention on is where we focus our energy, and that is what we make happen. That is why optimism is so mandatory in our line of work on sustainability. But there's two kinds of optimism. There's basically the unconditional one. Is like a child waiting for presents. You just sit around and say, oh, everything will turn out fine. That's not what we need. We need what Paul Romer calls conditional optimism. That's like a child wanting to build a tree house. If you've ever worked with a child, basically bothering everybody and say, come on, we can do this and we can find the tools and then you can help. And until you've mobilized enough action, that it happens. That is conditional optimism. You have to really believe that we can do this, because we can. Of course we can. We can turn this around. And I think it's not only feasible that we restore nature at scale, that we slow global warming, because it's inevitable. The alternative is just unthinkable. Do we want to end this experiment called human civilization? I don't think so. I think we still have a lot to give to this planet and vice versa. So it is our only option to be very strong conditional optimists. And that's a mindset. It's not something that happens to you because of the data around you. It's something that comes from within.
So one of the last questions I'm going to ask is tying it to your work with Salesforce as VP of Climate Action. Could you talk about work you're doing in your current role that relates to all these topics that we're talking about, right? Ecosystem restoration, maybe even circularity, all these concepts. Could you discuss that a little bit?
So at Salesforce, I'm responsible both for our energy portfolio and our carbon credit portfolio and for nature-based solutions. And one of the things my team is responsible for is our commitment to conserve and restore 100 million trees by 2030 as part of the Trillion Trees Initiative. It's a global effort to restore forest ecosystems. And that's something that we focus now more and more on water restoration, watershed restoration, to ensure that there's enough freshwater replenishment for data centers that we depend on for our office locations. So we're planting right now in the latest batch about 7 million trees in locations around the world just this year. So we're doing between 8 and 12 million trees per year. We're also purchasing large amount of carbon credits, which I know is not uncontentious, but from our perspective, we do everything we can to reduce our emissions as a company. Very strong science-based targets, for example. And then at the same time, and right now, as a sort of last but not later option in our climate action, we also invest in carbon credits. And a lot of those are nature investments around the world. So it is a fantastic opportunity, and Salesforce is a company that's really walking the talk, not only for themselves, but we always try to get other companies more engaged. It's it's important for us that success lies in collective action. We can succeed in this if we work together, private sector, government, civil society, and pulling all of them together. In the case of the Trillion Trees Initiative for forests, you then see really systemic change at global level happening.
So with that 100 million trees initiative that Salesforce is doing, can other companies, donate money into that and then take carbon credit for that as well?
We are now almost 100 companies in the initiative. So Salesforce is not the only one. There's MasterCard, Bank of America. There's a lot of large names in that initiative together with us who are also investing in forest. They do it for a variety of reasons, always depending on what is most important to the company. If you take companies in travel and tourism, there's a hotel chain, for example, like Iberostar. Of course, what is most important to them is that their destinations remain beautiful and well protected from storm surges. So they're investing in mangroves, which are sort of the superheroes of forest ecosystems. And it depends on what is important to the company. But there's now almost 100 companies that are already investing. But we would really like to see a lot more, because every big company can do more, including ourselves. We don't take ourselves out of that equation, but we would like to see a lot more companies making nature part of their balance sheet and having a nature strategy and investing back in nature. And carbon credits is one of the ways you can do that.
Well, I think the final thing I'll ask is, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are very interested in reading the book, getting their copy. And I think you mentioned October 14th, it'll be available on Amazon. Where else can they find this if they want to read this?
I have a lot of friends who've told me they've ordered it through their local bookstore, which is still sort of, I think, is still for many people their preferred way of buying books, but it's also on Indigo and Books A Million. So all the major platforms you can order it. And please find me on LinkedIn, anybody who's interested. I'd love to hear feedback about the book, and hugely grateful to Jane Goodall, who wrote the foreword, and her team, and everybody who's given endorsements for the book. And yeah, thanks for having me again
It's a pleasure
on your show.
Number 2, you're one of the only people that we've had on twice. So really happy to sit down with you today.
Pleasure.
Yeah.